In the unforgiving landscape of the American Southwest, where the sun scorches the earth and survival depends on the strength of your gun hand, most men learn quickly that kindness is a luxury few can afford. But what happens when a simple act of compassion, sharing a meager meal with a stranger, becomes the catalyst that changes not just one life but the destiny of two warring peoples? Today I'm going to tell you the extraordinary true story of Jake Morrison, a cowboy so poor he owned nothing but the clothes on his back and a horse that should have been put out to pasture years ago. His single act of kindness toward an Apache woman would set in motion events that no one could have ever imagined. Before we dive into this incredible tale, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because stories like this one remind us that sometimes the most powerful moments in history come from the most unexpected places. The town of Copper Ridge sat like a festering wound in the Arizona territory, its wooden buildings bleached white by the relentless sun and constant fear. It was 1882, and the Apache Wars had turned every shadow into a potential threat, every stranger into a possible enemy. Jake Morrison had been living on the outskirts of Copper Ridge for 3 years, and in all that time, he'd never quite managed to belong. At 28, he was lean as a whip with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of desert sage. His clothes were patched and repatched, his boots held together more by hope than leather. The other cowboys called him Broke Jake behind his back, though never to his face. Not out of respect, but because there was something in Jake's quiet demeanor that made even the hardest men think twice about pushing him too far. On this particular morning, Jake was camped by Willow Creek, about 2 miles from town. He'd managed to catch 3 small fish the night before and was carefully rationing them over his small fire when he heard it, the soft sound of someone moving through the brush. Jake's hand moved instinctively to the worn grip of his Colt .45, but he didn't draw. Instead, he called out in a voice that carried no threat, only weariness, "I know you're there. If you're looking to rob me, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed. If you're hungry, well, that's a different conversation." The brush parted, and Jake felt his breath catch. An Apache woman emerged, moving with the fluid grace of her people despite the obvious exhaustion that weighed down her shoulders. She was young, perhaps 25, with long black hair that hung in tangled strands around a face marked by hunger and desperation. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the small clearing. Jake had seen Apache before, usually at a distance and usually under circumstances that ended in gunfire. But this woman, there was something in her dark eyes that spoke of intelligence, of a spirit that refused to be broken. "You speak English?" Jake asked quietly. The woman nodded once, a sharp, economical movement. "Some." "You hurt?" Another nod, this one accompanied by a slight grimace as she shifted her weight. Jake looked at his meager breakfast, 3 small fish that would barely fill his own empty stomach. Then he looked at the woman again, taking in the hollow of her cheeks, the way her dress hung loose on what had once been a fuller frame. "Well," he said, settling back on his heels, "I reckon 3 fish is too much for one man anyway. You hungry?" The woman's eyes widened slightly, and Jake could see the war playing out behind them. Pride battling with desperate need. In the end, need won. She nodded again, this time with something that might have been gratitude. "Come on then," Jake said, gesturing to a flat rock near the fire. "Name's Jake Morrison, and you are?" "Aiyana," she said softly, limping forward to settle carefully on the rock. "It means eternal blossom." Jake smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn in weeks. "That's a pretty name, prettier than Jake, that's for certain." As he carefully divided the fish, giving Aiyana the larger portions despite her protests, Jake found himself studying her face. There was something regal about her bearing, even in her current state. This wasn't just any Apache woman, there was authority in the way she held herself. "You're a long way from your people," Jake observed, handing her a portion of fish wrapped in a clean cloth. Aiyana accepted the food with both hands, a gesture Jake recognized as one of respect. "My people, they think I am dead. Are you?" For the first time, Aiyana's lips curved in what might have been a smile. "Not yet." They ate in companionable silence, the morning sun climbing higher and casting long shadows across the desert floor. Jake found himself stealing glances at his unexpected breakfast companion. "You're not afraid," Aiyana said suddenly, her English careful but clear. "Should I be? Most white men, they see Apache, they see enemy, they see death." Jake considered, this chewing thoughtfully on his fish. "I reckon I see a woman who's hungry and hurt, same as I'd see any person in need. Color of your skin doesn't change that." Aiyana studied him with those intelligent dark eyes, and Jake had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing far more than he intended to reveal. "You are different," she said finally. "So I've been told. Usually not meant as a compliment. It is. From me." As they finished their meal, Jake noticed movement in the distance, riders approaching from the direction of town. His stomach clenched. As he recognized the lead figure, Sheriff Tom Brennan, a hard man who'd made his reputation fighting Apache. "Company coming?" Jake said quietly, standing and moving to block Aiyana from view. "Might be best if you made yourself scarce." But Aiyana made no move to leave. Instead, she stood as well, her chin raised in a gesture of defiance that Jake recognized all too well. "I will not run," she said simply. The riders were close enough now that Jake could see the grim expressions on their faces, the way their hands rested on their weapons. Sheriff Brennan rode at the front, his pale eyes scanning the campsite with the intensity of a predator. "Morrison," Brennan called out as he reined in his horse. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Jake stepped forward, his hands visible and empty, but his posture radiating a quiet strength that made the other riders shift nervously in their saddles. "Have him breakfast, Sheriff. Last I checked, that wasn't against the law." Brennan's eyes fixed on Aiyana, and Jake saw the man's hand move toward his gun. "That's an Apache, Morrison. A goddamn Apache, sitting at your fire like she owns the place." "That's a woman," Jake corrected, his voice still calm but carrying an edge now. "A hungry woman who I offered to share a meal with. Again, last I checked, hospitality wasn't a crime in these parts." "Hospitality?" One of the other riders, a rancher named Pete Hawkins, spat into the dust. "Morrison, that savage would slit your throat soon as look at you." Jake felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. "Funny thing, Pete. She's been sitting here for the better part of an hour and I still got my throat. Maybe your information's not as reliable as you think." The tension in the clearing was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jake could feel the weight of 6 pairs of eyes on him, could sense the barely restrained violence radiating from the mounted. "Men, you're making a mistake, Morrison," Sheriff Brennan said, his voice low and dangerous. "A big one. That Apache's probably a scout, gathering information for a raid. You're harboring the enemy." "I'm sharing breakfast with a hungry woman," Jake replied. "If that makes me an enemy in your eyes, Sheriff, then I reckon we've got different ideas about what it means to be human." The standoff might have escalated into violence, if not for the sound of approaching hoofbeats from the opposite direction. All heads turned to see a small group of Apache warriors emerging from the desert, moving with the fluid grace of men born to the saddle. At their head rode an elderly man, whose very presence seemed to command respect. Jake had heard stories of Nalnish, the Apache shaman whose wisdom was legendary even among his enemies. The old man's face was a map of the desert itself, weathered, lined, but possessed of an ageless quality that spoke of deep knowledge and hard-won understanding. "Grandfather," Aiyana said softly, the word carrying layers of meaning that Jake didn't fully understand but could feel in his bones. Nalnish dismounted, with the easy grace of a man half his age, his eyes moving from Aiyana to Jake, to the mounted white men with their hands on their weapons. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear. "I come for my granddaughter," he said simply. "She has been lost to us." Sheriff Brennan's hand was still on his gun, but Jake noticed that the man made no move to draw. There was something about the old shaman that gave even the hardest men pause. "Your granddaughter was trespassing on white land," Brennan said, though his voice lacked its earlier aggression. "Consorting with known troublemakers." Nalnish's eyes moved to Jake, studying him, with an intensity that made the young cowboy feel as though his very soul was being examined. The old man took a step forward, then another, until he stood directly in front of Jake. "You shared food with her," Nalnish said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, sir. Seemed like the right thing to do." "Even knowing what she is? What her people have done to yours?" Jake met the shaman's gaze steadily. "I know what some of her people have done, just like I know what some of my people have done. But I don't hold a person accountable for the actions of others. She was hungry. I had food." Nalnish nodded slowly, and Jake caught a glimpse of something that might have been approval in the old man's eyes. The shaman turned to look at Aiyana, speaking to her in rapid Apache. Jake couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the concern in the old man's voice. When the conversation ended, Nalnish turned back to Jake. "My granddaughter tells me you showed her kindness when you had no reason to do so. That you protected her when others would have harmed her." "I didn't do anything special," Jake said, uncomfortable with the attention. "Just treated her like I'd want to be treated." "Ah," Nalnish said, and now there was definitely approval in his voice. "But that is special, young warrior. More special than you know." The old shaman reached into a leather pouch at his waist and withdrew something that made the Apache warriors behind him straighten with surprise. It was a small piece of turquoise, carved into the shape of a running horse and suspended on a leather cord. "This belonged to my grandfather's grandfather," Nalnish said, holding the pendant up so that it caught the morning light. "It has been in my family for 7 generations, passed down only to those who show true courage, not the courage of the warrior, but the courage of the heart." Jake stared at the pendant, then at the old man. "Sir, I can't accept that. I didn't do anything to earn—" "You showed kindness to your enemy," Nalnish interrupted. "You risked the anger of your own people to help one of mine. In my culture, this is the highest form of bravery." The shaman stepped forward and placed the cord around Jake's neck, the turquoise horse settling against his chest with a weight that seemed far greater than its actual mass. "But this is not just a gift," Nalnish continued, his voice taking on a quality that made everyone present lean forward to listen. "It is a sign, a mark of destiny." Sheriff Brennan shifted nervously in his saddle. "Now see here, old man." Nalnish raised a hand, and the sheriff fell silent. When the shaman spoke again, his voice carried the weight of prophecy. "I have seen this man in my dreams," he said, his eyes fixed on Jake. "I have seen him standing between 2 peoples, his hands extended to both, offering peace where there has been only war." Jake felt a chill run down his spine despite the desert heat. "Sir, I think you might have me confused with someone else. I'm nobody special, just a cowboy trying to get by." "The spirits do not make mistakes," Nalnish said, firmly. "They have marked you, Jake Morrison. They have chosen you for something greater than you can imagine." The old shaman turned to address the mounted white men. "Hear me, men of Copper Ridge. This man has shown honor where others have shown only hatred. He has proven that the heart can be stronger than fear. Remember this day." With that, Nalnish helped Aiyana mount one of the Apache horses. Before they rode away, she looked back at Jake, her dark eyes holding a message he couldn't quite decipher. "Thank you," she said simply, "for seeing me as a person, not an enemy." "Take care of yourself," Jake replied. "And maybe we'll meet again under better circumstances." Aiyana smiled, the first real smile Jake had seen from her, the spirits willing. As the Apache riders disappeared into the desert, Sheriff Brennan and his men sat in stunned silence. Finally, the sheriff spoke, his voice uncertain. "Morrison, what the hell just happened here?" Jake touched the turquoise pendant at his throat, feeling its smooth surface warm against his skin. "I honestly don't know, Sheriff, but I got a feeling things are about to get interesting." Word of the encounter spread through Copper Ridge like wildfire, and by evening Jake found himself at the center of a storm he never saw coming. The saloon buzzed with heated conversations, and Jake could feel the weight of suspicious stares as he nursed a single whiskey at the far end of the bar. "I'm telling you, Morrison's gone soft in the head," Pete Hawkins was saying loudly enough for the entire saloon to hear, sitting down to breakfast with a savage like she was his Sunday school teacher. "Worse than soft," added another voice. "He's gone native. You see that heathen trinket around his neck?" Jake kept his eyes on his whiskey, but his hand unconsciously moved to the turquoise pendant. Since putting it on, he'd felt different. Not cursed, as the men suggested, but more aware somehow. Colors seemed brighter, sounds clearer. "Maybe we should ask Morrison himself what he thinks he's doing," came a new voice. Tom Bradley, the town's banker and one of its most influential citizens. "After all, a man's got a right to explain himself before we pass judgment." The saloon fell quiet as Bradley approached Jake's table. The banker was a small, neat man with thinning hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Mind if I sit?" Bradley asked. Already pulling out a chair, Jake gestured to the seat. "Free country, is it?" Bradley settled himself and signaled the bartender for a drink. "Sometimes I wonder. Seems like fear's got more say in how we live than freedom does." Jake studied the banker's face, looking for the trap he was sure was. "Coming. You got something to say, Mr. Bradley. I'd appreciate you saying it straight." Bradley smiled, and Jake was surprised to see genuine warmth in the expression. "I like that about you, Morrison. No dancing around the point." The banker leaned forward, lowering his voice. "What you did today, it took guts. I shared breakfast with a hungry woman. Don't see how that takes much courage, don't you?" Bradley's eyes were serious now. "Look around this room, Morrison. Count the men who would have done the same thing. I'll save you the trouble. There aren't any." Jake glanced around the saloon, taking in the hostile faces, the whispered conversations that stopped when his eyes passed over them. Maybe they're smarter than I am, or maybe they're more afraid. Bradley accepted his drink from the bartender and took a careful sip. Fear makes cowards of us all, Morrison. But you chose compassion over fear. Rare. Enough to get a man run out of town, seems like. Bradley was quiet for a moment, considering. There are some who'd like to see that happen, I won't lie, but there are others, more than you might think, who are tired of living in fear. And which are you, Mr. Bradley? The banker smiled again. I'm a man who believes that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is extend your hand to someone who's supposed to be your enemy. He stood, leaving money on the table for both their drinks. Think about that, Morrison. As Bradley walked away, Jake found himself alone with his thoughts, and the weight of the pendant around his neck. The turquoise seemed to pulse with warmth, and for a moment he could have sworn he heard something, a whisper of wind that sounded almost like voices. The saloon doors swung open, and Jake looked up to see Doc Henley entering. Doc was Copper, Ridge's physician, a man in his 60s with kind eyes and hands that had saved more lives than anyone could count. Jake, Doc said, settling into the chair Bradley had vacated. Heard you had quite a morning. News travels fast. In a town this size, faster than a prairie fire. Doc studied Jake's face with the practiced eye of a man accustomed to reading people. How are you holding up? Jake shrugged. Been better. Been worse. That's not what I meant, and you know it. Doc leaned forward, his voice gentle but insistent. What you did today, it's going to change things. Are you ready for what's coming? I don't even know what's coming. Neither do I, Doc admitted. But I know this, that Apache Shaman didn't give you that pendant as a decoration. In their culture, such gifts carry weight, responsibility. Jake touched the turquoise horse, feeling its smooth surface. He said something about destiny, about me being a bridge between peoples. And what do you think about that? I think he's got me confused with someone else. I'm nobody special, Doc. Just a cowboy who can't seem to catch a break. Doc was quiet. For a long moment, his eyes thoughtful. You know, Jake, I've been practicing medicine for over 30 years. I've seen men who had everything, money, power, respect, and I've seen men who had nothing but the clothes on their backs. What's that? The measure of a man isn't what he has. It's what he does when he has the choice between right and easy. Doc stood, placing a gentle hand on Jake's shoulder. You chose right today, son. As the evening wore on, Jake found himself the subject of increasingly hostile attention. Men who had barely acknowledged his existence before now went out of their way to make their displeasure known. Someone accidentally bumped into him hard enough to spill his drink. Through it all, Jake remained calm, but inside, he could feel something building, not anger exactly, but a kind of resolve he'd never experienced before. The pendant seemed to grow warmer against his chest, and with that warmth came a strange sense of clarity. He was finishing his drink when the saloon doors burst open and Sheriff Brennan strode in, his face grim. The lawman's eyes swept the room before settling on Jake. Morrison, Brennan called out. Need to talk to you. Outside. Jake stood slowly, aware that every eye in the saloon was on him. He followed the sheriff out into the cool night air where Brennan was waiting with 2 of his deputies. We got a problem, Brennan said without preamble. Word came in from the Hendricks ranch. Apache raided them this afternoon. Killed 2 men, ran off with a dozen head of cattle. Jake felt his stomach clench. I'm sorry to hear that, Sheriff, but I don't see what it has to do with me, don't you? Brennan stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. Funny how you have breakfast with an Apache woman in the morning, and by afternoon her people are raiding white settlements. That's ridiculous, and you know it. Is it? One of the deputies spoke. Up. How do we know you didn't tell them about the ranch's defenses? Jake felt the anger rising in his chest, but with it came that strange clarity again. Because I don't know anything about the Hendricks ranch defenses. Hell, I've never even been to their spread. So you say, Brennan replied. But that Apache trinket around your neck tells a different story. This pendant was a gift, Jake said firmly. A thank you for showing basic human decency. If that makes me a traitor in your eyes, then maybe the problem isn't with me. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, and Jake could see the deputies, hands hovering near their weapons. But before the situation could escalate further, a new voice cut through the night. Sheriff Brennan. All 4 men turned to see Doc Henley approaching, his medical bag in hand and his face set in lines of grim determination. Doc, Brennan acknowledged. This doesn't concern you. Doesn't it? Doc stopped a few feet away. I just came from the Hendricks place, treated the wounded, examined the scene, and the raid happened at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Jake was in the saloon from noon until just now. I saw him there myself, along with about 20 other witnesses. Brennan's face darkened. That doesn't prove... It proves he couldn't have passed information to anyone, Doc interrupted. The sheriff stared at Jake for a long moment, clearly frustrated. Finally, he stepped back. This isn't over, Morrison. I'll be watching you. I'd expect nothing less, Jake replied calmly. As the lawman walked away, Doc moved to stand beside Jake. You handled that well. Did I have a choice? There's always a choice, Doc said quietly. You could have let anger make your decisions for you. Instead, you kept your head. Jake touched the pendant again, feeling its warmth. Doc, do you believe in destiny? The older man considered the question seriously. I believe that sometimes the universe puts us exactly where we need to be, when we need to be there. As they stood in the quiet street, Jake found himself looking up at the star-filled sky. Somewhere out there, Aiyana and her grandfather were probably looking at the same stars. Doc, he said quietly, I think my life just got a whole lot more complicated. The best lives usually do, Doc replied with a smile. The question is, what are you going to do about it? 3 weeks after the encounter at Willow Creek, Jake Morrison found himself riding towards something that should have been impossible, a meeting between Apache leaders and the town council of Copper Ridge. The turquoise pendant had grown warm against his chest that morning, and somehow he'd known that this day would be different. The message had come through Doc Henley, delivered by a young Apache brave who had appeared at the physician's office like a ghost materializing from the desert. The brave had spoken only a few words in broken English. Nalnish wants bridgemans come peace talk. Now as Jake rode toward the designated meeting place, a natural amphitheater in the rocks about 5 miles from town, he could see riders approaching from 2 directions. From the east came Sheriff Brennan, Mayor Williams, Tom Bradley, and several other town leaders. From the west came Nalnish and a small group of Apache warriors. Jake reached the meeting place first, dismounting near a large flat rock that would serve as a natural table. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor, and the silence was broken only by the whisper of wind through the rocks. Nalnish arrived next, his weathered face showing no emotion as he dismounted and approached Jake. The old shaman studied the young cowboy for a moment, then nodded approvingly. You came, Nalnish said simply. You asked me to. I asked the bridge to come. I was not certain the man would answer. Before Jake could respond, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of the white delegation. Sheriff Brennan led the group, his hand resting on his gun butt, his pale eyes scanning the Apache warriors with obvious suspicion. Morrison, Brennan said curtly as he dismounted. Hope you know what you're doing. Makes 2 of us, Jake replied. Mayor Williams, a portly man with a perpetually nervous demeanor, stepped forward. Mr. Morrison, I want it understood that you're here as a facilitator only. You don't speak for the town of Copper Ridge. Understood, Jake said. I'm just here to help folks talk to each other. Nalnish moved to the flat rock, placing his hands on its sun-warmed surface. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the small amphitheater. I come to speak of peace, he said, his English careful but clear. My people are tired of war. Your people are tired of fear. Perhaps it is time to find another way. Sheriff Brennan snorted. Peace? Your warriors raided the Hendricks place just 3 weeks ago, killed 2 good men. And your soldiers killed 6 of my people at Willow Springs last month, Nalnish replied, calmly. Including 2 children. Shall we count all the dead, Sheriff? The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, and Jake could see hands moving toward weapons on both sides. He stepped forward, the turquoise pendant warm against his chest. Maybe we could talk about the living instead of the dead, he said quietly. About the children who are growing up afraid on both sides. Nalnish nodded approvingly. The bridge speaks wisdom. I'm not a bridge, Jake said. I'm just a man who thinks there's got to be a better way than killing each other. Are you? Nalnish's eyes held depths that seemed to see beyond the immediate moment. Tell me, Jake Morrison, what do you see when you look at my warriors? Jake looked at the Apache men, really looked at them. He saw weathered faces marked by hardship and loss, eyes that held the same wariness he'd seen in the faces of the white townspeople. But he also saw something else, a dignity that couldn't be broken. I see men who love their families, Jake said finally. Men who are trying to protect what matters to them. And when you look at the white men? Jake turned to study Sheriff Brennan, Mayor Williams, and the others. Again he saw past the surface hostility to the fear beneath. Same thing, he said. Men trying to protect what they love. Nalnish smiled, the first time Jake had seen such an expression on the old shaman's face. Now you begin to understand why the spirits chose you. Tom Bradley stepped forward, his banker's instincts recognizing an opportunity. "What exactly are you proposing, Nalnish?" The old shaman reached into his leather pouch and withdrew a small object, a piece of white stone carved into the shape of a dove. He placed it on the flat rock, then looked at each man in turn. "A treaty," he said simply. "Not the kind your government makes, full of words that change meaning like shadows at sunset. A real treaty, between people who must live on the same land." "What kind of treaty?" Mayor Williams asked, his voice skeptical. "Safe passage for both peoples, shared use of water sources, trade instead of raids." Nalnish's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "My people have knowledge of this land that goes back generations. Your people have tools and skills we could use. Sheriff," Brennan shook his head. "It sounds good in theory, old man. But how do we know your warriors won't use any agreement as a chance to get close enough for a massacre?" "How do we know yours won't?" Nalnish countered. "Trust must begin somewhere." "Sheriff?" Jake felt the pendant pulse with warmth, and suddenly he found himself speaking words that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. "What if we started small?" he said. "What if we picked one thing, one simple thing, that both sides could agree on?" "Such as?" Bradley asked. Jake looked around the amphitheater, his mind racing. Then his eyes fell on the carved dove, and inspiration struck. "Water," he said. "Willow Creek runs through both Apache land and white settlements. What if we agreed to share it? Set up specific times when each group could use it, with no weapons allowed within 100 yards of the water." Nalnish considered this, his weathered face thoughtful. "It could work. Water is life, sacred to both our peoples. And if someone breaks the agreement," Brennan asked. "Then they answer to both sides," Jake said. "Apache justice and white justice working together." The silence that followed was heavy with possibility. Jake could see the wheels turning in, each man's mind, weighing risks against potential benefits. Finally, Mayor Williams spoke. "It's not impossible. We'd need guarantees, of course." "As would we," Nalnish agreed. "But the bridge is right. Trust must begin somewhere." Over the next 2 hours, the details were hammered out. Times for water access, protocols for resolving disputes, consequences for violations. It wasn't a comprehensive peace treaty, but it was a beginning. As the meeting concluded, Nalnish approached Jake one final time. The old shaman reached into his pouch and withdrew another object, a small piece of silver shaped like a star. "This belonged to a white soldier," Nalnish said, placing the star beside the turquoise horse on Jake's chest. "A man who showed mercy to Apache prisoners when he could have shown cruelty." Jake stared at the silver star, feeling its weight. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because you understand what he understood. That courage is not about killing your enemies. It is about seeing them as human beings." Nalnish's eyes held depths of wisdom earned through decades of conflict. "You are the bridge between worlds, whether you accept it or not." As the two groups prepared to leave, Sheriff Brennan approached. "Jake." The lawman's face was still hard, but there was something different in his eyes, a grudging respect. "Morrison," Brennan said quietly, "I still don't trust them, and I still think you're taking a hell of a risk. But maybe that's what it takes." Maybe," Jake agreed. As Jake rode back toward Copper Ridge, the two pendants, turquoise and silver, Apache and white, rested against his chest like a physical reminder of the impossible thing that had just happened. Behind him, the sun was setting over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The water-sharing agreement would hold for 6 months before the first real test came, a drought that forced both peoples to rely on each other for survival. But that's another story. What mattered now was that a bridge had been built, one conversation at a time. Jake Morrison had started the day as a poor cowboy with nothing but the clothes on his back. He ended it as something he'd never expected. To be a symbol of hope in a land that had known too much hatred. The spirits, it seemed, had chosen well. Years later, when historians would write about the end of the Apache Wars in Arizona Territory, they would focus on the big names, the generals and politicians, the famous chiefs and celebrated battles. But in the small town of Copper Ridge, they tell a different story. They tell of a poor cowboy who shared his breakfast with a hungry woman, and how that simple act of kindness became the foundation for something extraordinary. They speak of the water-sharing agreement that grew into a comprehensive peace treaty, of the trading posts that replaced raid routes, and they remember Jake Morrison, the bridge between worlds, who proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon against hatred is an open hand and a willing heart. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. History is full of ordinary people who did extraordinary things, and their stories deserve to be told. What act of kindness will you perform today that might change the world? Let us know in the comments below.